Okay, so some of you requested a review of the brand new gaming laptop, the Acer Nitro V15, and what the heck, here it is. A new 2024 budget Nitro series model, and as Jared's tech stated that 2024 models probably should be skipped, we're gonna look into that.
This is Hubwood.
Now, for today's review, I was testing the Acer Nitro V15 ANV51560K with a 75W RTX 4050 and the Intel Core i5-13420H with 4 performance cores which support hyperthreading and 4 efficiency cores for a total of 8 cores and 12 threads, as well as 2 8GB sticks of DDR5 5200 MHz RAM and an NVMe SSD with a decent reading speed of around 4GB per second and 3.5GB per second for the writing speed. By the way, there is a second M.2 slot, which is nice. But it is also available with an RTX 4060, and for the CPUs you can also get it with an i7-13620H and also Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7 CPUs, while it is even available with an RTX 3050 down to an RTX 2050 mobile, and they would perform quite a bit slower than today's tested model. So there is a vast variety of versions available. The lowest spec model starts around $699 in the US, up to $1,200 for the highest spec version, while today's unit costs around $830 in the US. And spoiler upfront, like always, it comes down to the price when talking about a recommendation. But more about that later. For the US market, you can actually configure the Nitro V15 to your liking on the official Acer website. And don't mix it up with the Acer Nitro 16, which is a bit of a more expensive and better built model with different features. Oh, and while we're at it, most people watching my reviews aren't subscribed yet. That's a shame. Maybe you can do something about that? Thank you. Now, the Acer Nitro V15 comes in a full plastic body with a clear gamerish design on its lid with some blue and silver elements. Not my cup of tea, but to each their own, I guess. It's 23.5mm thin and weighs a total of only 2.1 kg, while the small 135W AC adapter adds another 500 gram. I guess the overall build quality could be best described as subpar, with a bending and wobbly lid and hinges that don't feel very confident, since they have quite some wiggle room while they open the screen to a maximum angle of around 140 degrees. At the beginning, it was impossible to open the laptop with one hand, while that became actually possible after opening and closing it for a few times.
Sus.
Once opened, we're getting a white illuminated keyboard, which is mediocre but functional. I actually wrote the whole script for this video on it, and it worked okay, to be honest. While there is not much flex, but overall it feels kinda cheap. The numpad is pretty small and the arrow keys are of a questionable layout. The FN or function keys are quite tiny and the power button isn't highlighted in any special way. The big touchpad is a bit to the left, but my palm didn't register mouse movements while gaming like at all. Clicking it sounds cheap and feels a bit wobbly though. And here you can also find the fingerprint sensor, which worked flawlessly for me. One of the Nitro V15's bigger flaws is definitely its display. A full HD IPS screen with 144Hz but no adaptive sync technology. The brightness is very low with only around 265 nits. Actually, when filming the laptop with the screen turned on and all my lights turned on, the display was already clearly not bright enough. The color accuracy is pretty mediocre with 68% for the sRGB and only around 50% for the Adobe RGB, the P3 and the NTSC color spaces. Also, the initial color calibration was pretty off to begin with. The black to white response time is very high with around 25 milliseconds and even 34 milliseconds for 50% gray to 80% gray. So if you're sensitive to that, that might not be the right gaming laptop for you. Now, considering this is a budget gaming laptop, the connection options are decent. On the left side, we're getting 2x USB 3.8 ports and a Thunderbolt 4 port, which can be used to charge the laptop or attach another monitor, as well as an HDMI 2.1 port. An upside-down LAN port, for which you will need to lift up the laptop to unplug the cable, and the power connector. And on the right side, we are getting another USB 3.0 Type-A port and the 3.5mm audio jack, as well as a Kensington lock. So I wouldn't really complain about the overall ports and their layout like at all. Oh, and one side note, you really need to push that power plug in with quite some force as it is quite stubborn. By the way, this is what the integrated camera looks like and what the integrated microphone sounds like. The speakers get very loud and the sound quality could be worse while it lacks bass, which was expected. But the loudness is really quite surprising. The Acer Nitro software can be accessed by the Nitro button in the top row of the keyboard and allows you to choose between 3 different performance modes, which are silent, balanced and performance. On battery, we are only getting the balanced and the so-called eco mode. On the performance mode, while plugged in, the Nitro V15's GPU is slightly overclocked by 100 MHz on the core and 200 MHz for the memory speed, while the fans can get pretty loud that way. The balanced mode performs only slightly slower, while the loudness is quite acceptable, and the silent mode is actually really silent, while the Nitro V15 still gets enough power for gaming. The fans are always on and slightly hearable when the laptop is plugged in, even when using the silent mode. Only on battery and the eco mode it can get completely silent when the 2 fans turn off from time to time. It is also possible to set the fan speeds manually, and it's worth noting that the maximum fan speed pushes the noise to a hurtful level where not even headphones would save you. I compared the 3 modes in Forza Horizon 5 at 1080p and Ultra settings, which gives you a first impression of its performance. On battery, the performance dropped so much that it's almost unplayable due to very bad frame times and rubber banding, meaning it quickly changes the FPS from low to high and back sometimes. But be aware that the NVIDIA Whisper mode is set to on by default on battery, which caps the FPS to 30, while that actually helps a lot in stabilizing the gameplay to a playable extent. So one should probably leave that untouched and activated. By the way, there is no mux switch in case you wonder. The laptop's cooling system seems to be very good overall, as while using a simple laptop stand at a room temperature of around 21 degrees, the GPU and the CPU seem to hover around 65 degrees Celsius all of the time in all 3 performance modes, which is a superb result. And this might also be due to the important fact that the GPU inside of here is only capable of pulling a maximum of 75 watt with dynamic boost, but in reality it was more like 60 watt while gaming all of the time. While the total power draw of the laptop was around 120 to 135 watt, which isn't a lot to cool down in the first place. Be aware that this means you are getting a lower powered RTX 4050 compared to many other laptops out there. It is pretty comparable to the 2023 GB G5 on that matter. For the 57 Wh battery, I was testing the V15 on idle with minimum display brightness, which resulted in around 13 hours of battery runtime. Watching YouTube at 50% display brightness using headphones at 20% loudness resulted in around 5.5 hours, and playing Forza Horizon 5 at 1080p and Ultra settings with a 30 FPS cap resulted in 1.5 hours of battery time. Considering the rather small size of 57 Wh, these are decent runtimes, especially on idle. Actually, opening the V15 is very easy by just releasing 11 Phillips screws, which all have the same size. Then use a credit card or any pry tool at the front and you're inside. Be aware that the battery is loose and could fall out if you don't watch out. Once inside, you could easily access the 2 RAM sticks for an upgrade or add a second M.2 SSD right here, and you could also easily change the battery. You can also see the pretty decent cooling system with the 2 fans and the 3 heat pipes. For Cinebench R23, the i5-13420H was getting a score of 11,553 for the multi-core and up to 1,660 for the single-core test, which actually isn't a lot, but it should be enough for gaming nevertheless. By the way, after a few runs, the multi-core score dropped to around 11,140 points. The PC Mark X results have been a bit disappointing, with only up to 6,827 points while plugged in using the laptop's performance mode, down to only 3,733 on battery using the eco mode. In 3D Mark Firestrike, the performance was pretty similar on all 3 performance modes, with up to 18,860 points and up to 7,930 points for the times by benchmark. For Blender, I compared the RTX 4050 75 watt in the Acer Nitro V15 with a full-powered 140-watt RTX 4050 and an RTX 4060 mobile, while the full-powered RTX 4050 mobile turned out to be barely faster. And of course, this laptop would also be powerful enough for video editing with Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve if you don't mind the mediocre screen. Also, upgrading the RAM to 32GB would be a good idea for rendering and video editing. And now let's have a quick look at the gaming capability of the Acer Nitro V15 in some games where I used the performance mode all of the time.
All games have been recorded via a capture card, so there is no performance loss. For Hogwarts Legacy, I was using 1080p at high settings with DLSS activated on the quality setting. I saw an average of 79 FPS with the 1% lows being at 29 FPS, while that is mostly the game's fault as it is commonly known to stutter a bit once you enter a new area for the first time in a gaming session. But beside that, it was perfectly playable and the frame times were actually really good otherwise, which I haven't seen on a lot of systems in this game yet. I guess they finally fixed the game and probably Nvidia helped a bit with newer drivers as well. And as you can see, in this game the GPU only draws around 60 watt. For Counter-Strike 2 I was testing the medium preset at 1080p, resulting in an average of 221 FPS with a 1% low of 97, while it is common for CS2 to get around half the average FPS as 1% lows on most systems I've tested. But of course this title would be perfectly playable on the Acer Nitro V15 in any case, and it also makes perfect use of the high refresh monitor. And while we're at it, take a look at the GPU usage, which indicates that the CPU is actually the real bottleneck in this case, since it's not nearly fully utilized on medium settings. In Warzone, I was using the minimal settings to see what the maximum reachable FPS would be at 1080p when using DLSS on the quality setting once more. Around 125 FPS on average and 62 FPS for the 1% lows are surely a playable result, and you even could use the higher DLSS settings and frame generation, while I'm not sure if people actually use that in such a game due to the higher input lag this can cause in some scenarios. And once more, with these low settings, the i5 actually seems to become a bottleneck as the GPU usage is often way lower than 90%. But I was testing frame generation in Cyberpunk 2077 combined with high settings and DLSS on quality, which resulted in a very high average FPS of 123 with a good 1% low of 77 FPS. And it actually ran really well, even when driving a fast car, which can often cause issues on weaker systems. Despite the high FPS, the CPU doesn't seem to be a big bottleneck in this case. But I was really surprised how well this game worked, so I also tested it with the ray tracing medium preset and DLSS on quality plus frame generation, which resulted in a still very playable 72 FPS on average with a 1% low of around 39 FPS, while this game surely benefits from the reflections and the ray tracing lighting. So even with this lower powered 4050, the laptop could definitely handle some ray tracing in AAA games, I guess. In Microsoft's Flight Simulator, I was running the game at 1080p with the high preset, which worked fine beside the texture loading issue I had for the plane textures. I saw an average of around 50 FPS flying over New York City, with the 1% lows being at 23 FPS. But for this game, this surely is well enough and absolutely playable, while looking pretty nice overall. Well, except for the plane texture thing, of course. Diablo 4 was no match for the Acer Nitro V15, since even with the high ray tracing preset plus frame generation and DLSS on quality, the game ran with a high average of 130 FPS and a 1% low of 54, which was mostly caused by stutters when entering new areas or before cutscenes. I also have to point out that the relatively small VRAM size of 6GB wasn't really an issue in the games I've tested for this review.
So the gaming experience was mostly pretty decent, and I say mostly because I did have severe issues playing Elden Ring, which was often suffering from heavy frame drops that made the game unplayable. Well, now I guess it is basically an okay entry-level gaming laptop. It has some pros like the battery life and the cooling system, as well as some cons like the build quality and the display. In the end, it all comes down to the price. But then again, you could probably get more performance for the same amount of money when getting an older 2023 model, which is what, as mentioned before, Jared stated in one of his latest videos, and I totally agree. You don't get really any benefits from getting the Nitro V15 that older laptops in this price region can't get you. I mean, having Thunderbolt, USB-C charging and a good set of connections is nice to have, but depending on the price, I'd probably favor an Asus TUF A15 or a F15 or a Lenovo LOQ15 or a Gigabyte Aorus 15. If you can get one on sale for a good price, then sure, why not? And that's all for today. If you like the content, consider leaving a thumbs up or subscribe to the channel for more laptop reviews and benchmarks in the future. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, consider becoming a member for only 99 cents per month. That would be highly appreciated. Thank you. Also, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye bye and cheers.